Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today we are rapidly unpacking an absolute masterpiece of English literature, J.B. Priestley's An Inspector Calls. Now, on the surface, this play is a gripping, incredibly tense Edwardian thriller. It's got all those classic elements of a drawing room mystery. But, as we're going to see today, Priestley uses this suspenseful format to deliver a deep, hidden societal message that is honestly just as relevant today as it was when it was first performed. So get ready because we are about to completely dismantle a very wealthy family's perfect illusion.
Okay, let's look at exactly where our story begins. We open in the year 1912 with the patriarch of the family, Arthur Burling. He's a factory owner, he's this hard-headed man of business, and he is a fierce, uncompromising defender of rugged individualism. Right at the very start of the play, he explicitly mocks the whole concept of community. He actually tells the younger generation that the idea of people caring for one another is just nonsense, dismissing social responsibility as being mixed up together like bees in a hive. He firmly believes that a man just has to mind his own business and look after himself, and that's it.
But, Priestley is setting this arrogance up for a massive fall. Literally, just as Mr. Burling is lecturing his family on the virtues of selfishness, there is a sharp knock at the door. So what happens when a mysterious inspector arrives to prove his entire worldview wrong? This visceral shock of an unexpected police investigation is about to completely shatter this wealthy family's insulated, privileged little bubble.
Part 1. A Deadly Interruption.
Picture this. The Burlings are right in the middle of this opulent, celebratory dinner. They're drinking port, they're celebrating the engagement of Arthur's daughter Sheila to a wealthy young guy named Gerald Croft. Everything is just perfect. And then, Inspector Gould walks in and drops a dark, gruesome breadcrumb. He announces that a young working-class woman named Eva Smith has died at the infirmary. She committed suicide by swallowing strong disinfectant. It is a horrific image. And the immediate question Priestley plants in our minds right there is, how on earth could this oblivious, wealthy family celebrating in their lavish dining room possibly be involved with a destitute woman dying in agony across town?
Okay, let's dive into this timeline for a second, because it's absolutely crucial for understanding the brilliant dramatic irony Priestley creates here. The play is set in 1912. That's an era of Edwardian optimism, rigid class hierarchy, and it's the year the quote-unquote unsinkable Titanic sets sail. Mr. Burling actually confidently predicts in the play that there'll be no war and the Titanic won't sink. But here's the catch. Priestley actually wrote the play in 1945, right at the bitter end of the Second World War. The 1945 audience had just lived through the horrors of 2 world wars and the Great Depression. They knew for a fact that the 1912 arrogance and capitalist optimism of men like Burling was destined for absolute disaster. The 1945 audience was progressive, they were calling for a welfare state, which makes Priestley's critique of that 1912 setting incredibly powerful.
Moving on to Part 2, the chain of events.
So, the inspector doesn't just walk in and arrest a murderer. Instead, he investigates with intense purpose, taking down one person at a time and revealing this interconnected web of the Burling family's actions. Priestley's core concept here is like a giant puzzle. Every single action has a consequence. Eva Smith's tragedy wasn't caused by one fatal blow. It was a devastating chain of selfish acts committed by literally every single person at that dinner table.
Let's look at how relentless this interrogation actually gets. The inspector breaks down their guilt step by step. First, Mr. Burling admits he fired Eva from his factory for participating in a strike for higher pay. Boom. Then, it's revealed Sheila used her wealthy status to get Eva fired from her next job at a dress shop, simply out of petty jealousy. Next, Gerald is forced to confess he kept Eva, who had changed her name to Daisy Renton by this point, as his secret mistress, only to discard her when it suited him. Then, Mrs. Burling, who is sitting on a charity committee, maliciously refuses to help the now destitute and pregnant Eva. And the final, sickening blow? The father of that unborn child is none other than Eric Burling, the family's own son.
Part 3. The Class Wall. Let's zoom out from the whodunit and look at the whydunit.
This central ideological clash in the play is laid out perfectly right here. Priestley juxtaposes 2 fundamentally different ways of viewing society. He doesn't force us to choose a side, but rather he presents them as the main driving forces of the narrative. On one side, we have the capitalism represented by Mr. Burling. It's individualistic, it's profit-driven, and it quite literally views people like Eva Smith not as human beings, but simply as cheap labor to be exploited. Directly opposing this is the socialism championed by Inspector Gould. He acts as the voice of collective responsibility, famously asserting that we don't live alone, but rather we are all members of one body.
Now, what's really interesting is how Priestley visualizes this immense inequality through a rigid class pyramid. He uses class differences as a metaphorical wall. The Burlings enjoy an affluent, totally comfortable life up at the top, completely insulated from the poverty down at the bottom. Characters like Mrs. Burling ignorantly link class with morality, just assuming a working-class girl like Eva must be inherently inferior. The wealthy use their status as a thick wall to separate themselves from the impoverished, shielding themselves from any real accountability.
Which brings us to part 4, the generational divide.
So once their sins are laid completely bare, how do they react? Priestley doesn't just have them all break down crying, nor do they all just laugh it off. Instead, he divides the family's capacity to process guilt squarely along generational lines. You have the inspector in the center urging collective responsibility, but the reactions branching out from him are wildly different depending on the age of the character.
And this divide builds into one of the play's absolutely crucial takeaways. The older generation, Arthur and Sybil Burling, entirely refuse to change. Even after hearing that horrific chain of events, they deny any real guilt. Mr. Burling is worried only about a public scandal, and Mrs. Burling actually justifies her cruel actions as her duty. Unbelievable, right? But the younger generation, Sheila and Eric, are fundamentally transformed. They step up and accept personal responsibility for the part they played in Eva's death. Why this matters for us, and especially for Priestley's 1945 audience, is that Sheila and Eric represent hope. They show that a more empathetic, progressive society is possible, but only if the younger generation is willing to learn from the devastating mistakes of the past.
And finally, part 5, the final twist.
Talk about building the dramatic tension back up. After delivering his final damning speech about fire, blood, and anguish, Inspector Gould just abruptly leaves. The family is left totally reeling. But then, Gerald Croft returns with a massive revelation. He's discovered that Inspector Gould wasn't a real police officer. The guy was an imposter. Suddenly, Mr. and Mrs. Burling are overjoyed. They celebrate. They believe the whole thing was a hoax and they've successfully dodged a public scandal. They go right back to their arrogant, selfish ways, completely unbothered by the moral weight of what they actually did. But then, the telephone rings. It's the real police. A young girl has just died at the infirmary after swallowing disinfectant, and an inspector is on his way to ask them some questions. The older generation thought they were completely safe, only to find the ultimate consequence of their actions has finally arrived.
Which leaves us with this chilling final thought. If the real police are only just arriving right now, who or what was Inspector Gould? Was he a ghost? A time traveler? Was he a direct proxy for J.B. Priestley himself? Or perhaps he's a meta-warning to all of us about the inescapable nature of collective guilt. Priestley doesn't give us a neat, easy answer. Instead, he leaves us examining our own lives, wondering how our actions ripple through the hive. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and until next time, keep asking the hard questions.